At 2 a.m., I was unlocking the door to my own cabin when I got a phone call from a woman I'd never met, accusing me of breaking into my own house. 10 minutes later, cops showed up. And yeah, things got weird fast. I thought she was just another overzealous HOA type with nothing better to do, but the way she kept watching me, that's when I realized something was seriously off. Ever had a neighbor act like they were guarding a state secret? Drop your weirdest HOA story in the comments. I read them all. You're watching QX Stories, and this one still messes with my head. The drive from Sacramento to my mountain cabin usually takes about 4 hours, but that night it felt like forever. I'm Lucas Sterling, 35 years old, and I work in computer security for the federal government. The past 6 months had been absolute hell. Debugging security systems, working 18-hour days, living on coffee and determination. I just wanted to hit the shower and crash hard. 12 hours, minimum. It's a little cluster of cabins around a lake, about 20 homes, maybe less. It's the kind of place where you'd expect neighbors to wave and maybe bring you cookies, not, well, you'll see what I mean. I pulled into my driveway at exactly 2 a.m., headlights cutting through the darkness. The cabin looked perfect, exactly as I'd left it 6 months ago. I slid my key into the lock. It clicked. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer it. I mean, who calls at 2 in the morning? But something made me pick up. Hello? I said, still fumbling with my keys in the dark. Her voice? Think chalkboard meets angry voicemail. It was sharp, demanding, and completely caught me off guard. Who are you? Why are you coming home at this hour? I actually had to pull the phone away from my ear for a second. Excuse me, who is this? I asked, genuinely confused. I mean, seriously? Someone's calling me to question why I'm entering my own house? I'm Denise Harrow, HOA president, she snapped back. You're violating quiet hours after 10 p.m. I've been watching, and this is completely unacceptable behavior for our community. I'm standing there in my own driveway, key still in my hand, trying to process what I'm hearing. This woman is literally policing when I can come home to my own property. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Look, I've dealt with difficult people in my line of work, but this was something else entirely. Ma'am, I'm sorry for any disturbance. I'm Lucas Sterling. I own this cabin. I just returned from a business trip but she cut me off mid-sentence. I've never seen you before. Prove it, she demanded. Prove it? I'm standing at my own front door with my own key, and this stranger is demanding I prove I belong here. I understand your concern, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I can assure you I'm the legal owner of this property. I work for the federal government, and my job requires travel at unusual hours. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd calm down. I was wrong. I don't care who you claim to work for, she said, her voice getting even more aggressive. This is a peaceful neighborhood, and we don't tolerate suspicious activity. You could be anyone, a burglar, a criminal, anything. I'm calling the police right now. I actually looked down at myself. Sweatpants, travel bag, no ski mask. Did I look like a threat? And then she hung up on me. I stood there, staring at my phone, wondering if I'd somehow entered an alternate universe where coming home to your own house was a crime. I mean, I wasn't even sure if I was overreacting. Maybe she was just being cautious, but something about her tone, her immediate hostility, told me this wasn't normal neighborhood concern. This was something else entirely. 10 minutes later, I was inside trying to figure out where I'd packed my towels when I heard the doorbell ring. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 police officers standing on my porch, looking about as thrilled to be there as I was to see them. They both looked tired, probably pulled away from actual emergencies to deal with this nonsense. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, a figure emerged from the shadows near the street. It was a woman in her 50s, wearing a red silk robe and slippers, marching toward my house like she owned the place. This had to be Denise Harrow, and she was grinning like she'd just won the lottery. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "This person claims to own the house but arrived at a very suspicious hour. Given the recent break-ins in the area, I thought it best to be cautious. He could be a burglar for all we know." I actually had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing, but the officers were just doing their job, so I tried to be respectful. "Officers, I'm sorry you had to come out here. I'm Lucas Sterling, and this is my cabin. I just returned from a work trip. The younger officer looked at me sympathetically. Clearly, he dealt with overzealous neighbors before. "Sir, we just need to verify your identity and we'll be on our way. Do you have any identification?" This is where things got interesting. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my federal ID. Not my driver's license, not my credit card, my federal ID. The officer's flashlight beam hit it, and I watched the entire atmosphere change in an instant. Both officers straightened up, their casual demeanor shifting to something more professional. "Sorry, sir, we didn't realize." The senior officer started, but I cut him off with a wave. "No problem, officers. You're just doing your job, and I appreciate you taking community safety seriously." But it was Denise's reaction that really caught my attention. She had been standing there with this triumphant smile, probably expecting to see me arrested or at least humiliated. Instead, she watched that federal ID come out, saw the officer's reaction, and her face went from red to white in about 2 seconds flat. "Ma'am," I said, turning to look directly at her, "I'm Lucas Sterling, legal owner of this lakeside cabin. I work for the federal government in computer security. My job requires travel at unusual hours, but I assure you I have every right to be here." The officers apologized again and started walking back to their car, but Denise just stood there, frozen. Not embarrassed frozen, scared frozen. She stared like I just flashed a gun, not a bat. I couldn't figure out why. Or maybe I could, but I didn't want to admit it yet. I mean, I'd just proven I was exactly who I said I was, right? The drama should have been over, but something in her expression told me this was just the beginning. The police drove away and I went back inside, thinking that would be the end of it. But through my window I could see Denise still standing there in the street, staring at my cabin like it was hiding something. She wasn't moving, wasn't going back to her house, just standing there in her red robe, watching. I thought showing my federal ID would end everything, but her expression told a different story. This wasn't over, this was just the beginning, and I had no idea what I was walking into. The next morning, I woke up to 17 new emails. 17. All from the same address, denise.harrow.hoa@mountainlake.com. I'm not even joking, this woman had apparently spent her entire night documenting every possible violation she could think of. Violation notice number 1. Vehicle parked 2.3 feet from curb instead of regulation 2.5 feet. I had to read that twice. She actually measured the distance from my car to the curb and found it lacking by 0.2 of a foot. Who even owns a curb ruler? I mean, who has that kind of time and that level of obsession with other people's parking? But it got worse. Violation notice number 2. Outdoor lighting exceeds acceptable brightness levels for mountain atmosphere preservation. My porch light, my standard Home Depot bought porch light, was apparently too bright for the mountain atmosphere. I'm reading this thinking, seriously, this is what she's worried about? Then came violation notice number 3. Lawn maintenance below HOA standards, grass height inconsistent with community guidelines. I actually laughed out loud at that one. It was February, there was snow on the ground. What grass was she even talking about? I started wondering if maybe I was dealing with someone who had some serious issues, or if this was just her way of trying to establish dominance after last night's embarrassment. By the 12th email, yes, I counted, I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Urgent. Unauthorized surveillance equipment detected on property. Remove immediately or face legal action. These weren't random complaints, they were designed to overwhelm me, to make me feel like I was constantly under surveillance. Surveillance? The only thing watching her from my place was a pine tree. I didn't even have a security system beyond that porch light she was complaining about. But this email was different from the others. While the parking and lighting complaints felt petty, this one felt scared, like she was worried I was watching her for some reason. Why would she think that? What could she possibly be doing that would make her paranoid about surveillance? I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, partly to clear my head and partly to see if I could figure out what was going on. The place was peaceful, too peaceful for all this nonsense. I was admiring the view when I heard a voice behind me. "You must be the new neighbor everyone's talking about." I turned around to see a sweet-looking woman in her 70s, wearing a thick winter coat and carrying a thermos of what smelled like hot chocolate. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile, the complete opposite of Denise Harrow. "I'm Harriet," she said, extending a mittened hand. "I live in the blue cabin over there. I heard about last night's excitement. I wanted to apologize for Denise's behavior." Finally, someone normal? I'm Lucas Sterling, I said, shaking her hand. And honestly, I'm not sure what I did to upset her so much. I mean, I just came home from a business trip. Harriet shook her head sympathetically. Oh dear, you didn't do anything wrong. She changed after her husband died. Controlling, paranoid, it got worse every month. That explained a lot, actually. Grief can make people act in strange ways, but this seemed extreme. Has she always been the HOA president? I asked, genuinely curious. Harriet sighed. She took over about a year after Richard died, said she wanted to honor his memory by keeping the neighborhood exactly as he would have wanted it. But Richard was lovely. He would have been horrified by the way she's been treating people. She's suspicious of everyone, especially newcomers. You're the first person to move in here in over 2 years, and I think your arrival really unsettled her. We talked for a few more minutes, and Harriet gave me some insight into the neighborhood dynamics. Sounds like she'd crowned herself Queen HOA, and no one dared question her rule. Most people just complied to avoid conflict. When I got back to my cabin, there were 3 more emails waiting. Email number 15 was the kicker. Final warning: compliance with all HOA regulations is mandatory. Failure to address violations within 24 hours will result in serious consequences. This is not a request. Serious consequences? For parking 2 inches too close to the curb? I was starting to think this woman might actually be unstable, but then I remembered her reaction to my federal ID, that look of genuine fear. This wasn't just about HOA regulations. Something else was going on, and I was apparently right in the middle of it, whether I wanted to be or not. That night, I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the stress of the situation, or maybe it was just being back in the cabin after 6 months away, but I found myself looking out the window at around 11:30 p.m. What I saw made me question everything I thought I knew about my neighbor. Denise was outside, sneaking around the empty lot between our houses near the lake shore. She was carrying a small flashlight and what looked like a piece of paper, moving carefully like she was trying not to be seen. This wasn't a casual evening walk. She was searching for something specific, constantly checking the paper like it was some kind of map. I watched her for about 20 minutes, and it was clear she was looking for something buried or hidden. She'd check the paper, take a few steps, check it again, then search the ground with her flashlight. Her movements were desperate, almost frantic. This wasn't the behavior of someone who was just being a difficult neighbor. This was someone who was genuinely scared and looking for something important. I started to wonder if her harassment of me had less to do with HOA violations and more to do with whatever she was searching for out there in the dark. The next morning brought email number 18. Violation notice. Excessive window lighting during quiet hours disturbs neighborhood tranquility. She was complaining about me looking out my own window. At this point, I was starting to think maybe I should just sell the cabin and find somewhere else to relax. I'd bought this place to get away from stress, not to dive headfirst into neighborhood drama. But then I thought about what Harriet had said. Nobody stood up to Denise anymore. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe she'd gotten so used to people backing down that she thought she could intimidate anyone. That evening, I was making dinner when I saw Denise outside again. This time, she had something else with her. It looked like a small handheld device, possibly a metal detector. She was systematically searching the same area, but now she was being even more methodical about it. Whatever she was looking for, she was convinced it was buried somewhere in that lot. And judging by her increasingly frantic behavior, she was running out of time to find it. I started to realize that this wasn't normal Karen behavior. She was looking for something valuable, something important, and somehow she thought I might steal it or interfere with her search. The question was, what was she hiding? The next morning, I woke up to an email that made my blood run cold. Urgent, community HOA meeting scheduled for today at 7 p.m. Subject: serious violations requiring immediate community action. All residents must attend. This wasn't just another violation notice. This was Denise going nuclear. She was taking our private conflict public, and I had a feeling this wasn't going to be just a friendly neighborhood chat. I mean, what was she planning to tell these people? That I was some kind of criminal because I came home at 2 a.m.? That my porch light was a threat to mountain atmosphere? Looking back, I should have known she was planning something big. I spent the day trying to prepare for whatever was coming. I printed out my property deed, my mortgage documents, even my federal ID credentials, anything that might help prove I belonged in this community. But honestly, I wasn't sure what I was preparing for. I'd never been to an HOA meeting before, and I had no idea what to expect. Was this going to be a formal hearing, a neighborhood tribunal, or just Denise standing up and making accusations while everyone else nodded along? I kept thinking maybe I was overreacting, but something about the way she'd been behaving told me this was serious. At 6:45 p.m., I walked over to the small community center near the lake. The place looked like it hadn't been renovated since Nixon. When I walked in, I immediately felt the tension in the room. 8 residents were scattered around folding chairs, and they all looked up at me with expressions ranging from curious to suspicious. I recognized Harriet, who gave me an encouraging smile, but the others were strangers. At the front of the room, behind a card table that served as a podium, stood Denise Harrow. She was dressed like she was heading to a corporate board meeting. Navy blue suit, pearl necklace, hair pulled back in a severe bun. This was not the same woman who'd been digging around in her bathrobe the night before. "Good evening, everyone," Denise began, her voice carrying that same authoritative tone I'd heard on the phone. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We have a serious situation that requires immediate community attention." She pointed at me like I was on trial. "As you know, we've had a new resident move into the Sterling cabin. While we always welcome new neighbors, there have been several concerning incidents that affect our community's safety and tranquility." Several concerning incidents? I'm thinking, lady, the only incident was you calling the police because I came home from work. But she was just getting started. First, there have been multiple violations of our community standards: improper parking, excessive lighting, and failure to maintain property according to HOA guidelines. She held up a stack of papers, presumably all those emails she'd been sending me. More concerning, however, is Mr. Sterling's lifestyle, which appears to be secretive. He arrives at odd hours, nobody knows exactly what he does for work, and his behavior patterns are inconsistent with our peaceful community values. I'm sitting there listening to this thinking, seriously? My lifestyle is secretive because I travel for work? Because I don't announce my schedule to the neighborhood? Which, okay, flattering, but also insane. But then she dropped the bombshell. Furthermore, when I attempted to address these concerns directly with Mr. Sterling, he became hostile and threatening. He claimed to have special privileges because of his government connections, and he implied that normal community rules don't apply to him. The room went completely quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, and I realized this was her strategy. Paint me as some kind of arrogant federal agent who thought I was above the law. It was brilliant in a twisted way because it played into every stereotype about government overreach and federal authority. And the worst part, some of the residents were nodding along with her story. I could see one of the board members whispering to the woman next to him. Another resident was giving me suspicious looks. Even Harriet looked confused and concerned. Denise had spent days building this narrative, and now she was presenting it to people who barely knew me. I had to respond, but I also had to be careful not to prove her point about being arrogant or threatening. I stood up slowly, trying to project calm confidence instead of frustration. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrow. I'd like to clarify a few things, if I may." The room was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "I'm Lucas Sterling. I own the cabin. I work in federal security." That's it. I looked around the room, trying to make eye contact with each person. I understand Mrs. Harrow's concerns about community standards, and I'm happy to address any legitimate issues. However, I want to be clear that I've never been hostile or threatening to anyone. My goal is simply to be a good neighbor and contribute positively to this community. I could see some of the tension leave the room, but Denise wasn't finished. "What about the unauthorized surveillance equipment?" she demanded, her voice rising. "I've detected electronic devices around your property that could be monitoring our activities." This was where things got interesting. I hadn't installed any surveillance equipment. I'd told her that in my email responses. But her accusation was so specific, so urgent, that I started to wonder if she was projecting her own paranoia onto me. "Mrs. Harrow, I haven't installed any surveillance equipment. If you're seeing electronic devices, they're probably just my motion sensor lights or the standard security features that came with the cabin." I paused, then decided to test something. If everyone's concerned about neighborhood security, I'd be happy to share some basic safety tips from my work experience. I could even do a basic security assessment of the area to help identify any potential vulnerabilities. The reaction was immediate and telling. When I mentioned checking the area for unusual activity, Denise practically jumped out of her chair. No, that's not necessary. This neighborhood is very safe. We don't need any kind of investigation or assessment. The obvious overreaction made everyone in the room stare at her, and I realized I'd hit a nerve. She wasn't just worried about surveillance, she was terrified of any kind of investigation. But why? What could she possibly be hiding that would make her so afraid of someone with security experience looking around? The meeting ended awkwardly after that. Denise hurriedly packed up her papers, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The other residents filed out quietly, whispering among themselves about her strange reaction. One of the board members approached me before leaving. "Lucas, I want to apologize. Denise has been intense lately. Most of us just go along with her because it's easier than arguing, but tonight was different. She freaked out when you offered to help." That's not normal. I thanked him and headed home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something bigger than HOA violations. Denise wasn't just trying to control me, she was desperately trying to keep me away from something. And now, I was starting to wonder if maybe I should investigate for real. The next morning, I was making coffee when I heard a soft knock at my door. Not the aggressive pounding I'd come to expect from Denise, but a gentle, almost hesitant tap. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing there, but she looked completely different. No suit, no pearls, just jeans, messy hair, and eyes that clearly seen no sleep. When I opened the door, she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Genuine vulnerability mixed with something that looked like desperation. "Lucas, may I come in? I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This was not the same woman who'd been screaming at me over the phone just days ago. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was some kind of trap or manipulation. Was this an ambush or just a breakdown? But something about her demeanor told me this was real. "Of course, come in," I said, stepping aside. She walked into my living room and sat heavily on the couch, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched a tissue. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry about everything. The phone calls, the emails, the meeting last night. I know I've been unreasonable. I know I've been acting like a crazy person." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Since Richard passed, I've been losing it. I know that. My husband, he passed away 3 years ago, and since then, I've become paranoid and controlling. I see threats everywhere. I suspect everyone of having ulterior motives. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to our neighbors. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this. After days of harassment and public humiliation, here she was genuinely apologizing and admitting she had problems. I understand grief can make people act in ways they normally wouldn't," I said carefully. "Losing someone you love is one of the hardest things anyone can go through. But Denise, some of your behavior has been pretty extreme. The constant emails, the police calls, the accusations at the meeting." She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know, I've been horrible. The thing is, after Richard died, I became terrified of change. This neighborhood, this community, it's all I have left of him. When you moved in, when I saw someone new, someone I didn't know, I panicked. I thought if I could control everything, if I could keep everything exactly the same, then maybe I could keep him alive somehow. But then her tone changed, becoming more urgent. "Can you forgive me? Can you please just let this go? I'll stop everything, the notices, the threats. I'll even resign from the HOA if that's what it takes. Just please don't investigate anything more. Please don't dig into neighborhood business or try to assess our security or anything like that." There it was again, that desperate fear of investigation. I was starting to understand that her apology, while probably genuine, was also motivated by something else. She wasn't just sorry for being difficult. She was terrified I might discover something. "Denise, I'm not investigating anything," I said gently. "I just want to live peacefully in my cabin. I don't have any interest in neighborhood drama or digging into people's private business." But she wasn't satisfied with that answer. "But you mentioned checking for unusual activity, doing security assessments. You work for the government, you have access to resources, databases, investigation tools." Her voice was rising again, the panic creeping back in. "You don't understand. There are things that shouldn't be disturbed, things that need to stay buried. That phrase stuck with me. Things that need to stay buried. She didn't mean metaphorically, I could tell. Given what I'd seen her doing in the middle of the night, I was starting to think she meant that literally. When the soft approach didn't work, she tried a different tactic. Her expression hardened, and suddenly I was looking at the old Denise again, the one who'd called the police on me. "You work for the government, so you should understand that some secrets need to stay secret," she said, her voice taking on a threatening edge. "There are things in this neighborhood, things about the past, that could cause problems for a lot of people if they came to light. Important people. People who wouldn't appreciate someone poking around where they don't belong." I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell is she talking about? What secrets? What important people? This was supposed to be a quiet mountain community, not some government conspiracy. "What secrets, Denise? What are you so afraid of?" I asked, but that just made her more agitated. "You don't need to know. You don't need to know anything except that you should sell this cabin and leave. Find somewhere else to live, somewhere else to relax. This neighborhood isn't right for you." She stood up abruptly, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "I'm protecting you. All of us. You just don't see it yet. But if you keep pushing, if you keep asking questions, if you keep threatening to investigate things, there could be consequences. Serious consequences." And then she stormed out, leaving me more confused than ever, and I stood there, heart racing, suddenly unsure who the real threat was. The next day, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. Not the gentle hum of a lawnmower or the distant rumble of a delivery truck, but the deep, grinding roar of construction equipment. I looked out my window and saw a small excavator in the empty lot next to my property, with Denise standing nearby holding what looked like the same piece of paper she'd been carrying during her midnight searches. A construction crew was digging a hole right next to my property line, and she was supervising with intense focus. This was not normal neighborhood maintenance. I threw on some clothes and walked over to see what was happening. "Denise, what's going on here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite my growing irritation. "Water pipe repair," she said without looking at me. "We detected a leak during our routine inspection. The crew needs to dig it up and fix it before it causes flooding. But I knew enough about construction to recognize that this wasn't a water pipe repair. They weren't following any utility lines, they weren't using the right equipment, and they weren't taking the careful measurements you'd expect for infrastructure work. They were searching for something, using Denise's hand-drawn map as a guide." "I didn't report any water leak," I said, watching the crew dig methodically through the frozen ground. "And I haven't noticed any flooding or water damage in the area." Denise finally looked at me, and I could see the desperation in her eyes. "It was an HOA routine inspection. We're required to check for potential problems before they become emergencies." But her story didn't make sense. HOA inspections don't typically involve excavation, and if there really was a water leak, the utility company would be handling it, not some random construction crew she'd apparently hired herself. I stood there, watching this woman frantically dig up our neighborhood like some kind of treasure hunter, and I had to ask myself, would you stay quiet or dig for the truth if you were me? This was clearly about more than water pipes or HVA violations. Denise was searching for something specific, something she was desperate to find before I discovered it, and her threats about serious consequences and important people were starting to make me think this might be bigger than just neighborhood drama. As I watched her direct the crew to dig deeper, I realized that maybe it was time I stopped being the nice guy and started being the investigator. Because whatever she was hiding, it was obviously important enough to risk destroying the neighborhood to find it. I called my lawyer, asked about my options for property damage and harassment. The advice was straightforward. Document everything, demand an explanation, and if she couldn't provide one, file a lawsuit and call for a police investigation. So I picked up the phone and called Denise directly. "You have 24 hours to stop the digging and explain exactly what you're looking for, or I'm filing a lawsuit and requesting a full police investigation into your activities." She didn't answer, not for a long, long moment. "You can't do that," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't get it. This goes higher than HOA drama. If you bring the police into this, if you start an investigation, people will get hurt. Important people, people who have the power to make problems for you." But I wasn't buying her vague threats anymore. "Then help me understand, Denise. Tell me what's really going on here, or I'm making that call." There was another long pause, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end. I can't tell you," But please, just trust me on this. Sell the cabin and leave. It's for your own good." That night, my phone rang at almost midnight. It was Denise, and she sounded completely different. Defeated, exhausted, maybe even relieved. "Lucas, can you meet me? At the digging site, I'll tell you everything. I can't keep doing this anymore." It felt like a trap, but her voice said otherwise. I grabbed a flashlight and walked over to the empty lot where she'd been conducting her frantic excavation. It looked like an abandoned dig site, and she looked like the ghost who dug it. She was wearing the same simple clothes from her apology visit, but now she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes were hollow, and she was clutching that piece of paper like it was the most important thing in the world. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm going to tell you the truth. All of it." I stood there in the moonlight, surrounded by the evidence of her obsession, and waited for her to explain what had driven her to this point. Richard worked for Mountain Resort Development. They were stealing millions from federal contracts. He found out, started collecting proof, and then he died. She paused, looking down at the crumpled paper in her hands. About 4 years ago, Richard discovered something. The company was stealing money from those government contracts. Over $2 million, maybe more. They were billing for work that was never done, inflating costs, creating fake expenses. It was massive fraud. This was no HOA feud. This was federal-level fraud. "Richard was a good man," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "When he found out what they were doing, he knew he had to report it. He started copying files, gathering evidence, building a case against them. But somehow they found out what he was doing. They started threatening him, following him, making it clear that if he went to the authorities, there would be consequences." She looked up at me with haunted eyes. "Richard got scared, not for himself, but for me. He was afraid they would hurt me to keep him quiet, so he copied everything onto a computer drive and buried it here in this lot. He drew me this map," she held up the paper, "and told me that if anything happened to him, I should use it to expose the truth." The pieces were finally coming together. "But then he died," I said, and she nodded. "Heart attack, right at his desk at work. The doctors said it was stress, but—" She trailed off. But I could see the suspicion in her eyes. For 3 years, I've been living in terror, afraid that if the people at Mountain Resort Development found out Richard had evidence, they'd come after me to clean up loose ends. And I've been obsessed with finding that drive because it's the only thing that can prove what they did and maybe give Richard's death some meaning. I stood there looking at this woman who'd been carrying this burden alone for 3 years, and I finally understood why she'd been so paranoid about investigation and surveillance. When you showed up with your federal ID and your computer security background, I thought, she laughed bitterly, I thought the government already knew about the fraud. I thought you were here to find the evidence and investigate me as an accomplice. I was terrified that you'd discover what Richard had hidden, and that I'd be arrested, or worse. It all made sense now. Her paranoia, her obsession, the fear in her eyes. She wasn't trying to hide something from me. She was trying to protect herself from what she thought I already knew. I look at her, thinking about all the crazy neighbor stories I've heard on various channels, but this was beyond anything I could imagine. "Denise, I had no idea about any of this," I said gently. "I really am just a guy who wanted a quiet place to relax. I'm not here to investigate fraud or dig up evidence. I just wanted to come home from work without being treated like a criminal." She looked at me with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "But now you know," she whispered. "Now you know what I've been hiding, what I've been looking for, and I still haven't found it. 3 years of searching, and I still don't know exactly where Richard buried that drive." I looked around at the torn-up lot, the abandoned equipment, the evidence of her desperate obsession, and I felt sorry for her. This woman had been living in hell for 3 years, all because she was trying to honor her husband's memory and protect herself from imagined threats. Standing there in the moonlight with a woman whose life had been destroyed by fear and grief, I had to ask myself, would you help or walk away if you were me? She'd made my life miserable for a week, but she'd been living in terror for 3 years. She'd called the police on me, but she'd been afraid I was going to have her arrested. She'd harassed me with emails and meetings, but she'd been trying to protect a secret that could destroy powerful people. Looking at her now, broken and exhausted and finally telling the truth, I realized that maybe she wasn't the villain in this story. Maybe she was just another victim of something much bigger and more dangerous than neighborhood drama. And maybe I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I called an emergency HOA meeting. This time, it wasn't about me. I had video evidence of the unauthorized digging, documented proof of the harassment, and Denise's own confession about the fraud investigation. When the 8 residents gathered in the community center, they could see immediately that something had changed. Denise was sitting in the back corner, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. This wasn't the confident, controlling woman who'd been running the HOA like her personal kingdom. "Thank you all for coming," I began, standing at the front of the room. "I know there's been a lot of tension lately, and I want to clear the air about what's really been happening." I looked around the room at faces that had been suspicious just days ago. First, I went to address the accusations that have been made against me. I have documentation here, proving that I'm the legal owner of my property, that I work for the federal government in computer security, and that I've never violated any reasonable community standards. One of the board members, who had been nodding along with Denise's complaints, suddenly looked uncomfortable. "More importantly," I continued, "I want to explain why Mrs. Harrow has been behaving so erratically. She's been dealing with some personal issues related to her husband's death, and unfortunately, those issues led to some very inappropriate behavior toward me and potentially toward other residents." I pulled out my phone and showed the video I'd taken of the unauthorized excavation. "This is footage of construction equipment digging up our community property without proper permits or board approval. Mrs. Harrow arranged this on her own without consulting anyone, and then lied about it being a water pipe repair." The room was dead silent as they watched the evidence of her deception. One of the residents, who'd been whispering about me during the first meeting, shook her head in disbelief. "Denise, is this true? Did you really hire a construction crew to dig up the neighborhood without telling anyone?" Denise looked up briefly, her eyes filled with shame, but she couldn't seem to find words. Harriet, the sweet elderly woman who'd been trying to mediate all week, spoke up. "Oh, Denise, why didn't you just ask for help?" But Denise just sat there in silence, staring at her hands. A board member who'd been one of Denise's supporters was visibly angry. "This is completely unacceptable. As board members, we have a responsibility to the community. We can't have someone in a leadership position making unilateral decisions and lying to residents about it." He turned to look at the other board members. "I move to remove Denise as president, effective immediately, and she pays for the damage." The motion was seconded and passed unanimously, with Denise abstaining. Just like that, her grip on the neighborhood was gone. "I need time to arrange some things," Denise said quietly, finally speaking up. "I think maybe I should move away from here. Start fresh somewhere else." The room was uncomfortable as everyone processed what had happened. The woman, who ran the HOA like a fortress now, couldn't even defend herself. I actually felt sorry for her. Even after everything she'd put me through, she'd been living in her own private hell for 3 years, and now that hell was finally collapsing around her. With Denise gone, people exhaled. Lights stayed on. Mailboxes stayed put. Neighbors who'd been walking on eggshells for months suddenly felt free to park normally, to have outdoor lights, to live their lives without fear of arbitrary punishment. The new HOA president was elected and immediately announced a policy of reasonable management, focusing on actual community issues rather than nitpicking individual behavior. It felt like stepping out of a storm. Denise was moving to Arizona. Harriet said she needed a reset and distance. I feel terrible for her, but I also feel relieved. The past few years have been so stressful with her in charge. Nobody knew what ridiculous rules she'd come up with next. I watched Denise packing up her house, avoiding eye contact with everyone, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness. This woman had made my life miserable, but she'd been suffering in ways I couldn't imagine. The day before she left, I was working in my garden when I saw Denise standing by the empty lot one last time. She was clutching that old map, looking at the torn-up ground where she'd spent so much time and energy searching for her husband's hidden evidence. She looked lost, defeated, like someone who'd spent years chasing a ghost and finally realized it was time to stop. She glanced up and saw me watching her, and for just a moment, our eyes met. There was no anger there anymore, no fear or hostility, just exhaustion and maybe a little bit of gratitude that her long nightmare was finally over. Watching her drive away the next morning, I felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy. The woman who'd called 911 on me at 2 a.m., who'd harassed me with emails and public accusations, who'd torn up the neighborhood looking for buried secrets, was finally gone. I could finally enjoy the quiet retreat I had originally planned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger. Because somewhere out there were still people who'd committed fraud, who'd threatened her husband, who'd caused all this pain in the first place. And I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't really the end of the story. 3 weeks after Denise left, I was finally settling into the peaceful mountain life I had originally envisioned. The neighborhood was quiet, the neighbors were friendly, and I could come and go from my own cabin without anyone calling the police. I was cleaning up my email inbox, deleting months of violation notices and community drama, when I came across an old message I'd completely forgotten about. It was from Reed Keller, a former colleague who'd moved up to become security division director at our agency. The subject line was simple: "Call me when you finish your Colorado project." I'd been so caught up in the HOA drama that I'd never followed up on it. I picked up my phone and dialed his number. "Reed, it's Lucas Sterling. I got your message about calling when I finished my Colorado work." Took me a while to call. Life got complicated. Reed laughed on the other end. "Lucas, finally, I was wondering when you'd surface. And actually, those complications you mentioned, they're exactly why I wanted to talk to you." Something in his tone suggested this wasn't just a casual catch-up call. "What do you mean, Reed?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I know you took some time off in Colorado, but I heard there was some kind of incident with a local HOA president? Something about a 911 call in your federal ID? Wait, how the hell did he know?" "Reed, that was just a neighborhood dispute, a misunderstanding with a difficult neighbor. It's all resolved now." But Reed was chuckling on the other end. "Lucas, that incident got reported up the chain. Local police filed a report about a federal agent being harassed by an HOA resident. When that report hit my desk and I saw your name on it, I got very interested." "Here's what caught my attention," Reed continued. "The police report described how you handled the situation. No abuse of your federal ID, no escalation to a security issue, no throwing around government authority to intimidate civilians. You solved the problem with patience, professionalism, and smart thinking. You let the situation resolve itself without creating a bigger incident." I was still processing the fact that my neighborhood drama had somehow become a federal case study. "Reed, I wasn't trying to handle anything professionally. I just wanted to get some sleep without being arrested for entering my own house." "That's exactly my point," Reed said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "You were under stress, dealing with an irrational person making false accusations, and you could have easily made it a federal issue. Instead, you de-escalated the situation and solved it without creating problems for anyone involved. That's the kind of leadership we're looking for. New division." I had no idea what he was talking about, but it sounded like this casual conversation was turning into something much bigger. "Our domestic security division is expanding," Reed explained. "We need team leaders who can handle complex situations involving civilians, local law enforcement, and potential security threats. Someone with technical skills and the ability to manage delicate situations without creating drama or escalating conflicts." He paused, and I could tell he was building up to something important. "Your HOA incident was like a perfect interview test, Lucas. You demonstrated that you can deal with difficult people, work with local police, and resolve conflicts without abusing your authority. That's exactly what we need in someone who will be leading teams in sensitive domestic situations." I sat there, holding the phone, trying to process what he was telling me. "Reed, I wasn't looking for a new opportunity. I was just trying to enjoy my vacation cabin without being harassed by my neighbor." But he wasn't finished. "The position comes with a significant promotion, a salary increase, and the chance to build a team from the ground up. You'd be protecting critical infrastructure, investigating potential threats, and working with local communities across the country. It's the chance of a lifetime for someone with your skills and experience." I found myself thinking about the past few weeks, about how a simple neighborhood dispute had somehow revealed my ability to handle complex human situations. "You spotted fraud, handled a volatile person, kept it quiet. That's rare," Reed continued. "You uncovered potential fraud, dealt with a mentally unstable individual, protected a vulnerable community, and resolved everything without creating a single incident report or federal case. You turned a potential disaster into a clean resolution. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need. I had to admit, when he put it like that, it did sound impressive. But I kept thinking about Denise, about what she'd lost chasing truth. Reed, what if I told you there might be more to that Colorado situation than just a difficult neighbor? What if there were actual crimes involved? Even better, Reed said immediately. If you can identify potential criminal activity while maintaining your cover as a private citizen, that's an even more valuable skill. We need people who can spot problems before they become major incidents. I sat there looking out my window at the peaceful mountain lake, thinking about how my quiet retreat had somehow become a launching pad for the biggest career opportunity of my life. This is a lot to process, Reed. Can I think about it for a day or two? But I already knew what my answer was going to be. This was exactly the kind of work I'd always wanted to do, and apparently I was already good at it. Standing there in my driveway the next morning, looking at my packed belongings and thinking about the decision I'd made, I had to ask myself, would you accept or decline if you were me? The lakeside cabin would stay as my retreat, but now I had a much bigger mission. I'd accepted Reed's offer and would be heading back to D.C. to start leading a team responsible for protecting critical infrastructure and investigating potential domestic threats. As I loaded my car, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange chain of events that had led me here. A difficult neighbor, a midnight harassment call, a buried computer drive, and somehow a promotion that would change my entire career. Looking at the empty lot where Denise had spent so many desperate hours searching for her husband's evidence, I thought about the irony of it all. Her fear of investigation had led to the perfect demonstration of my investigative skills. Her paranoia about federal agents had actually helped me become a better federal agent. Her attempts to drive me away had instead launched me toward the opportunity of a lifetime. Maybe she'd found some peace in Arizona? Maybe she'd finally let go of Richard's secrets and started living her own life again. As I drove away from the mountain cabin, I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. If you'd told me a Karen and a cabin would lead to a promotion, I'd have laughed. Now, I just nod. Because sometimes the most unexpected challenges really do lead to the greatest opportunities. And maybe, just maybe, Denise and I were both exactly where we needed to be all along. And if you're still here with me, first off, thanks for sticking through all of that. I guess the one thing I'd say is trust your gut, even when everything feels like small-town drama or just another angry neighbor with a clipboard. There might be more underneath. I didn't plan to get involved. I didn't want to solve anything, but life has a way of dragging you right into the middle of stories you didn't sign up for. If this hit close to home or made you raise an eyebrow at your own HOA, go ahead and tap that like button, drop a comment, or subscribe to Q Stories. I read every story you share, and honestly, they're what keep this going. And hey, if you want to help me keep the lights on around here, you can click that little thanks button down below. No pressure, just if you're feeling generous. Either way, appreciate you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. See y'all next time.